In this video, I want to talk to you about how pink chip stocks can help you make more money than the regular blue chip stocks, even in a recession like we're seeing at the minute. It was in 2018 that I was watching an annual general meeting of Berkshire Hathaway, and it was something that Warren Buffett said that took my portfolio investing strategy from making 5 to 10% underperforming the S&P 500 to massively outperforming the S&P. What Buffett pointed out was that retail investors have an extraordinary advantage over institutional investors like Berkshire Hathaway that often gets wasted, and I was very much guilty of this back in 2018. What I was doing wrong back then was two things. I was spending 90% of my time researching big blue chip stocks, but also I was way too value focused. So the other times when I wasn't looking at the blue chip stocks that I was seeing information about on Reddit and the news, was I was just using stock screeners to find things that were tremendous value on paper. But with that, there comes another issue. It's that the businesses are sometimes priced that way for good reason, and you won't know unless you know the business.
Jordan Belfort.
Jordan, what do you get on a blue chip stock?
I make 1%. I did make 1%.
Pink Sheets, it's 50.
Now, before I get too deep into this subject, I should say that blue chip stocks can obviously lead to exceptional gains, but one of the best ways to get exposure to blue chip large cap companies is to buy an index fund like the Vanguard S&P 500. And what I do is I put 10% of my annual income into the S&P 500, and that gets me all the exposure I need to blue chip stocks. So when I go to do my individual stocks and shares picking using another 10% of my annual income, in that event, I think it's silly to go after the same 500 companies that everyone is always talking about. Another enormous benefit of small cap pink chip stocks is they typically have far larger upside potential as an investment. So you only need 1 or 2 of, say, 5 of your investments that year to go well for you to be making exceptional gains. And that's what I noticed after I started picking smaller cap companies, is that, okay, maybe only 1 or 2 did well, but when they did well, they did incredibly well, and they carried my entire portfolio. That is why today we're going to be comparing the profits of the $125 billion Netflix from the point at which I started trading back in 2015 to the $100 million small cap pink chip stock, and seeing what would have been best for us as investors holding that company over that period of time. But before we get into that, I need to answer one question. Why do unprofitable hedge funds with terrible management incentive infrastructure love Netflix? Since Netflix has no profits back in 2015 and even beyond that, what Wall Street decided to do was value it based on the number of users it had rather than the amount of cash flow that it generated. Since, if Netflix raised prices or added adverts and cancelled production in order to return cash from the users to the shareholders, it wouldn't lose any of that revenue, right? It would be simply more profitable. So the more users, the better. They can switch on profitability at any time. The fact is, since Netflix initially IPO'd, in all the years it's been operating, it's operated at a net negative cash flow. So that means that it's actually cost shareholders money to own it. So even though people are willing to pay more for the business today, the shareholders that have been holding the business have actually had to spend money holding onto that stock rather than being returned cash for their shares. This is perhaps why I think that Netflix is perceived as such good value to consumers, because right now the people who are paying for the platform are the shareholders. Here's another question. How much would Netflix have earned me if I bought it back in 2015? If I bought £100 of Netflix back in 2015 when I began trading and held them until today, it would have actually cost me £28 in actual earnings. I'd be £28 into debt today. Now, even though the share price has gone up in value since that time, that share price is based on user growth and compounding user growth. So unless Netflix are able to increase the number of users on the platform, they're going to have to increase profitability of the platform in order to pay for the raising interest rates on the debt that Netflix holds. Another issue with Netflix's debt is the asset it's borrowed against is the shares itself. So as the shares in the business get cheaper and cheaper, the debt gets more and more expensive as it's seen as higher and higher risk. If Netflix's debt drops below half, Netflix are forced to dilute them in some cases in order to pay down the debt immediately. So Netflix could be forced into a real tight situation if their share price is to continue going down in the future. Now the next part here is why I bought Cineworld, a $100 million small cap pink chip stock in the middle of the pandemic, a small cap stock with a large amount of debt on its balance sheet and at the time wasn't able to make any money. Cineworld is a UK stock that owns and operates cinemas around the world. What Cineworld offers is a premium cinema experience. Now, I can't speak for it in every country in the world. I've only seen it in the UK, but Cineworld in the UK certainly does deliver on its premium experience. It has IMAX, and going to watch Dunkirk in IMAX in the small town which I grew up in, Chichester, was certainly a major difference from watching it at home, despite us always having state-of-the-art home cinema systems. In 2018, the purchase of Regal took their revenue from 800 million to 3 billion. However, even without the absurd amount of revenue that the Regal purchase brought Cineworld, they were still growing enormously in median gross profit every year. So median takes out the outlying years, so the most profitable years, it is their most average growth. And even that, compared to Netflix, their gross profit was incredibly competitive. It was almost exactly the same as Netflix, despite them operating with free cash flow, actually making the shareholders money. Cineworld operates with an enormous 10% free cash flow, median free cash flow, while Netflix operates with a negative 6% median free cash flow. So no wonder consumers love Netflix. They aren't really paying for it. Here's the thing, Cineworld got no advantage during the pandemic and has been hit by a lot of things in the last 2 years. And regardless of what happens in the Chapter 11 filings, I personally think that Cineworld are going to come out smelling great after Avatar 2 release and stuff like that. They've got loads of free cash flow coming, but regardless of what's happening, the reason I'm making this video comparing Netflix to Cineworld, blue chip versus pink chip, is they were being ignored before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, you got far more value from Cineworld than you did Netflix. Despite them both being very leveraged companies, one produced a ton of cash, the other didn't. One was in the S&P 500, the other wasn't even close. If I bought £100 of Netflix back in 2015, despite going into substantial amounts of debt, in cash flow alone, it would have returned me £50 in cash versus the £28 I've currently paid in order to operate Netflix. So this begs the question, why do institutional investors, hedge funds, hate Cineworld? Well, the first obvious answer is that, well, Cineworld is a small cap pink chip stock. It's too small for most hedge funds. The second issue is that Cineworld issues dividends. Despite aggressively investing back in the business and getting substantial growth for its investment, Cineworld actually returns cash to the shareholders, which hedge funds just hate. They want all the money to retain inside the business because they don't really make any money when companies issue dividends. They don't take a portion of that. So hedge funds absolutely hate it when companies issue dividends. And perhaps the reason that Cineworld issues a dividend is that the 𝗟𝗏𝗄𝗎 family own 20% of the stock, which is another thing that I think hedge funds try to avoid, is when they don't get the most controlling stake of the business. Now, number 3 is obvious, Cineworld's Chapter 11 filings, which is something that we actually share with hedge funds in hating. While it's accurate that most shareholders do not emerge from Chapter 11 filings with equity, most businesses don't have their 3 most significant revenue-generating events happen immediately after the filing during the bankruptcy process. The fact is, we analytical, sort of balance sheet focused investors often think of all the debt payments as being incredibly even and all of the revenue being stretched even every month. And where that might be true for some businesses, almost all of them, the revenue it peaks at one point of the year and is significantly lower at another point in the year. And for Cineworld especially, when there's no films in the cinema, when there's a dip in Hollywood blockbuster releases, Cineworld actually are cash negative for certain months of the year. And they make up for it by being incredibly cash positive at other points of the year. The issue for Cineworld is their debt payments are not the same. They are regular throughout the year. So when Cineworld has a significant debt payment to make, but they're currently making absolutely no cash, normally they would have cash reserves to deal with this. Well, after beaten with a stick for 2 years, they didn't have that this year. But with significant cash injections, their most profitable time of the year with their 3 biggest releases, they could easily recover the cash needed to pay for the 1 month they couldn't make interest payments. On top of this, it's also enabled them to drop leases that are non-profitable. So Cineworld has done a lot of acquisitions over the last several years, and they purchased some cinemas that are just really derelict and in terrible locations as part of these large acquisitions, and they are actually costing the business money. And by allowing Cineworld to discontinue these leases, Cineworld technically have wiped debt off the balance sheet. So by going into this Chapter 11 filing, Cineworld have actually loads of debt that they can wipe off the balance sheet and revenue sources on their way in that don't rely on them changing how the business operates fundamentally in order to pay down its higher interest payments. You can see where I'm going with this. If Netflix, the incredible blue chip stock, needs to pay off some of its debt, it needs to change how the business is operating fundamentally to become profitable. This is where Netflix is entering what I call the growth stock death circle. High debt costs lead Netflix to anti-consumer decisions like adding adverts and raising the cost of subscriptions and cancelling shows, which in turn leads to fewer sign-ups to the platform, which then lowers the share price of the stock, which in turn takes its risk score from, say, a BB to a BBB, which then in turn raises their interest payments, and we're back at the beginning of the circle. Netflix now need to do more anti-consumer decision making in order to afford its interest payments. Luckily for Netflix, however, there is a way that they can escape the growth stock death circle. Instead of releasing your most expensive film projects on a site where it can easily be streamed along with all the other cheap projects for one fixed fee, what you could do is release them in cinema first. The final chapter, how might Netflix avoid bankruptcy in 2023? This enables 2 things for Netflix. It enables them to make more content without having to do anti-consumer decision making. And Netflix is already trialing this with Glass Onion 2 being released in cinemas this December. Right now, Cineworld, a $100 million company that has an annual revenue of $3 billion when operating normally, I can see a really clear path that their regular free cash flow could take them out of bankruptcy, whereas Netflix, a $125 billion company, have a really tricky path ahead of them in order to finance its debt. My hope for the future is that Cineworld is going to be the world's largest cinema operator while Netflix is consolidated into Warner Brothers Discovery. Let's see if we can make it happen. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more, please like and subscribe. Okay, that's all from me. Goodbye, guys.